The Places That Scare You, a guide to fearlessness in difficult times. You know, a lot of people come to a spiritual path like Buddhism or unity for that matter, thinking that it's going to make all their problems go away. And instead, what usually happens, what really should happen, but what usually happens is we get brought nose to nose, eye to eye, face to face with our stuff, right? We get brought eye to eye with our deepest fears and insecurities, and instead of feeling better, well, we feel worse. And so often what people do is they abandon that path and they go looking for another path, like a bee, flitting from flower to flower to flower. Y'all know that old saying, right? When the going gets tough, give up. Move on to the next new thing. That's true, that's the original version. If it doesn't feel good all the time, well, there must be something wrong with it. Well, this book tells us that you can't dispel anxiety, fear, or uncertainty by trying to avoid all the places that scare us, all the things that cause a little bit of fear to arise. And as synchronicity and perfect divine order would have it, I woke up this morning and checked my Facebook feed, and one of the first things I spotted was a post from one of our Youth of Unity graduates, Emily, who posted this picture here. A head full of fears has no space for dreams. Isn't that the truth? A head full of fears has no space for dreams. So we want to open up some space. We want to make some room for the dreams to be able to work. And so, again, this is not about trying to avoid fear or make it go away. It's a paradox, because to be fearless means that we're willing to enter into the places that scare us. Just like the song that we did a little bit earlier, we're going to feel the fear and we're going to do it anyway, right? Fearlessness doesn't mean no fear. It means we don't let it stop us. We master it instead of the other way around. Mark Twain once said that courage is the mastery of fear, not the absence of fear. Another little quote that I like is from a fellow by the name of Earl Wilson, who said, "Courage is the art of being the only one who knows you're scared to death." And we have to give the last word to a Unity author here, Eric Butterworth. He said, "Beyond the appearances revealed in the mirror is the total person you are in spirit. There is that of you that is greater than your weakness, stronger than your fears." That's what we want to hear. The primary focus of any spiritual path is to put us in touch with the authentic self that is stronger than our fears and that can master the places that scare us. But first we have to be willing to enter into the places that scare us. And there's a story in the Gospel of Mark about Jesus and his disciples doing exactly that, coming face to face with a scary situation and how they dealt with that situation. So it starts out with Jesus, who had been speaking to a bunch of crowds all day long along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and the crowds had gotten so big that they were starting to push him back on the shore closer and closer to the water. So Jesus, being a very smart feller, decided that I'm going to get into a boat and we're going to row out into the water a little ways and use this as a speaking platform so the crowds can form on the shores. And he does this all day. And by the end of the day, he's pretty much done with the crowds. And so he says to his disciples, he says, "Let's get away from the crowd. Let's sail over to the other side of the lake for the evening." So as they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, this windstorm arises, and waves start crashing over the side of the boat, and the boat was in danger of being swamped. But apparently Jesus didn't think that this was such a big deal. Either that or he was dead tired, but either way, he's sound asleep on a cushion in the back of the boat. In the meantime, the disciples are starting to lose their cool. Now, one of the things we do in Unity is we engage in different varieties of Bible interpretation, and sometimes what you have to do when you interpret a Bible story is you have to fill in the parts that they leave out. Okay, it may sound like we're making stuff up, but that's not quite right, because there are some blank spaces in this story, so we have to read between the lines a little bit and fill in some of the missing pieces. There has to be more to the story than was originally written. So imagine what's going on here. One of the things we know about the disciples is that many of them were professional fishermen. They owned their own boats. They were experienced sailors. I mean, these weren't a bunch of landlubbers renting a houseboat for the weekend. They were professionals. They knew what they were doing out under the water. So the story tells us that waves were coming over into the boat. It was starting to fill up, and they were close to being swamped. Now I ask you, what would an experienced sailor be doing if water was coming over the side and filling up the boat? Bailing, right? Yep. They'd be grabbing buckets. They'd start bailing like crazy. Maybe they'd try to head towards shore. But you see, here's where we got to fill in the blanks a little bit, because you know what probably happened? Well, who do you figure was the captain of the boat? Probably Peter, right? Peter was sort of their leader. Peter was probably the captain of the boat, and the water is coming into the boat, and the wind starts to blow, and this voice cries out, "Yo, Peter, there's water coming into the boat." Peter says, "Yeah, no big deal. I've seen worse. Go wake some guys up, get the buckets, and start bailing." A few moments later, the same voice comes back and says, "Yo, Peter, where's the buckets at?" Peter says, "How should I know? James was supposed to load the boat, ask him." In the meantime, the waves are getting higher, more water's coming into the boat. James says, "Don't look at me. John was supposed to get the buckets." And John says, "Hey, I told Judas to do it." And Judas says, "Don't." He forgot the buckets. And you know what? They probably could have saved a lot of trouble right then and there and thrown them overboard. But there it is. He forgot the buckets. They're in a potentially dangerous situation, and they just made it worse because they weren't ready for it. Judas forgets the buckets, and so now the panic starts to set in. And haven't we all done something similar on occasion? Have you ever made a bad situation worse because you failed to prepare? Well, the disciples probably got complacent. They figure, hey, Jesus is in the boat. What could possibly go wrong? And they forgot the buckets. So the first part of the story is about complacency. The second part of the story is they start to panic. And the third part is about drama and victimhood. The disciples think the end is near. Guess what Jesus is still doing? He's sleeping. As far as Jesus is concerned, no buckets, no problem. He says, you guys will figure something out. You're the professional sailors after all. He's not worried. But the disciples are well and truly freaked out. And they start to make up stories about the situation, which again is something that we all do when we get into a dicey situation. We make up stories. They start making up stories about why Jesus is still sleeping. And this is a quote from the actual story. He, meaning Jesus, was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I mean, can't you just see it? He doesn't care about us. Nobody cares about us. Whatever will become of us? And then the story says that at this point, Jesus wakes up and he rebukes the wind and he rebukes the sea, and the storm stops and the water becomes calm once again. But Jesus wasn't finished yet. He wasn't done with his rebuking yet. He had some more rebuking to do. After things calm down, he turns on the disciples and he says, "What is the matter with you guys? What are you so afraid of? Don't you have any faith?" And a lot of people will look at this story and think, well, it's just a miracle story showing that Jesus is so powerful that he can control the weather. He can control the sea. Or others will use it to show the saving power of Jesus. But if that's all there is to the story, why did he give the disciples such a hard time for being afraid? You see, there's another teachable moment here. There's more to this story than controlling the weather and saving souls. This is a lesson in self-reliance. The disciples asked Jesus to help them, and like a good teacher, he does. But he isn't happy about it. He wanted them to have faith in themselves, which I translate as trust. Jesus had total trust in his guys, so much so that he was able to sleep through the storm. What he wanted most of all was for them to trust themselves. Jesus trusted his disciples, but the disciples, not so much. They gave up on themselves. They let a bad situation get worse, and then they gave in to panic and fear to the extent that they froze. They were incapable of taking any kind of creative action in response to the problem. So again, Jesus uses this as a teaching moment. I remember back in the days when we still lived in Illinois, I'd gotten my pilot's license and I was working on my instrument rating. And back in Illinois, most days were sunny and clear, so you really didn't get too many chances to actually go up and fly and train in the clouds in actual instrument flying conditions. So one of the things you would do in training is you would wear a visor like this guy here. You'd wear this thing down over your head, so the only thing you could see was the instrument panel. And in order to see outside the plane, you'd have to turn your head up like this, and then the instructor would know you're cheating. So the idea was like a horse with blinders on. So you'd have this thing on so you could only see the instruments, and you'd learn how to fly on instruments that way. And of course, you always have an instructor with you. And occasionally, what the instructor would do just to kind of liven things up a little bit is he would tell you to close your eyes. And he would take control of the airplane, and he would put it into some kind of a strange attitude, get you off course, and set it up in such a way that you really didn't know whether you were up or down or pointing at the ground or whatever. Then he'd give the controls back to you, tell you to open your eyes, and figure out by just looking at the instruments whether you were pointed at the sky or pointed at the ground, and get the airplane back into a safe configuration again. And sometimes, just to make things even more interesting, he would take a great big Post-it note and he'd cover up one of your instruments that you would rely on. They actually make Post-it notes for that purpose, and he'd cover up one of your instruments so that you would have to, rely on some kind of a backup procedure. And you always knew that the instructor was there to take control of the airplane if you really screwed up. But there was still, as you might imagine, a rather significant anxiety factor involved in going through these exercises. And there was an element of pride. Healthy pride, because you really didn't want the instructor to have to take over. You wanted to be prepared. You wanted to be up on your skills. You know that the instructor was going to be pushing you to the very edge of your resourcefulness, and you wanted to be ready for it. And isn't that what a good teacher does? A good teacher will push us to the very edge of our resourcefulness. And isn't that what life does? Isn't life a good teacher? Life will constantly push us to the edge of our resourcefulness. And sometimes there's someone there to catch us when we fall, to calm the storm, to take the controls. And other times we're on our own. And we dare not take any of those teaching opportunities for granted. In our gospel story, the disciples picked the perfect day to forget the buckets, right? They dodged a bullet. They got a little lucky. They didn't have to pay the ultimate price for complacency and lack of preparation. They didn't have to pay the price for giving in to fear and panic. In her book, The places that scare you, the author says this. She says, the essence of bravery is being without self-deception. However, it's not so easy to take a straight look at what we do. Seeing ourselves clearly is initially uncomfortable and embarrassing. Do you think the disciples were a little bit embarrassed? Experienced sailors, and we forgot the buckets. Forgot how to sail. Jesus, the great teacher, invited his students to take a closer look at themselves. Like good teachers, he holds this mirror up, and then he asks some questions. What went wrong here? What habitual patterns of mind might have led you to this kind of fear and panic that left you paralyzed? And what might you begin to do right now to learn from this situation and to take responsibility for the direction of your life from here on out? Now, I suppose one response to that would be never get on a boat again. Isn't that one of the ways that we react to those scary situations, to the places that scare us? Avoidance. You think that's an option for a fisherman? Not really. In fact, it's not an option for anyone who wants to fully experience this great gift of life. If we keep trying to avoid the places that scare us, we end up retreating into a very small and uninteresting place. We can create the illusion of safety. We create the illusion of this safe cocoon that's actually a prison. That's the extreme version of self-deception. We put ourselves in a prison that eventually becomes a kind of poison that chokes the joy out of life. Pema Chodron says, we always have a choice. We can let the circumstances of our lives harden us and make us increasingly resentful and afraid, or we can let them soften us and make them kinder. That's the choice we always face when we're in a place that scares us. Maybe instead of thinking about throwing Judas off the boat because he forgot the buckets, maybe we need to consider if we've ever done anything like that. And then maybe think about how we might have backed him up, double check the safety equipment. You know, in the book of Genesis, there's that story of Cain and Abel. Cain is quoted as asking this very important question. He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Well, the answer that Jesus would give us is yes, but only always. And that's especially true because we're all just like the disciples in this story. We are all in the same boat, literally and figuratively. We don't want to go out and create danger in our lives, and we don't want to delude ourselves into thinking that we can avoid the places that scare us. We will find them, they will find us. And the key to being prepared is to start seeing those places as offering us opportunities to practice self-awareness, compassion, and trust. And like good scouts, be prepared. Thank you.